Welcome to the Deep Blue on My Doorstep podcast. I'm Tracy Ainsworth from the University of New South Wales. In this podcast series, we will talk to marine experts about the marine environments that we have right on our doorsteps and what we can do to help conserve and protect these blue spaces. Hi, Nicholas. Welcome to the Deep Blue on My Doorstep podcast. Nicholas, you're a principal scientist with the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment and a specialist in threatened island fauna. And in particular, your research area is seabirds, is that correct?
Thank you. Yeah, pretty well. It's seabirds, when you study them, certainly on islands, you can't ignore everything else. And so not only do I specialise on seabirds, I'm involved in removal of feral animals. I'm also a botanist because you can't look at managing them on the island without managing the environment around them, particularly if there's invasive weed species that you have to deal with or changes in habitat or whatever. So yeah, a bit of a island generalist, but with a real passion for seabirds.
That's fantastic, because I think when we talk about marine places and marine ecosystems, like seabirds aren't necessarily the first thing that come to mind, but I mean, what you've just said is that they're integral part of, how connected those systems are and what is happening on the island, and also what is happening in the marine environment around them. I've noticed your work takes you to many of New South Wales islands and island habitats, and these islands are really key features of some of our most iconic marine parks. Can you tell us why these islands and island groups are so important to marine parks?
Okay. Islands in New South Wales, we have about a bit over 50 islands, which includes the Lord Howe Island Group, which is part of New South Wales. And really the biota that we're talking about on islands is unique. Often it's not so much the assemblage of the plant life or even the invertebrates, although with Lord Howe they have over 100 endemic species, so that is certainly the exception. But generally it's because these islands are supercharged by seabird guano, and often they're dominated by invertebrates because they usually have no mammals on them except the occasional insectivorous bat. So the whole idea that we have these unique islands which are driven by marine nutrients and are dominated by invertebrates provides us with a type of ecosystem that is very limited in its representation, both within New South Wales and around Australia. So they're absolute gems in our reserve system, because within New South Wales coastal areas, most of our islands are in fact nature reserves managed by National Parks and Wildlife Service.
What do we know about the seabirds on these islands? Are they connected?
It depends on what species you're looking at, and it also depends on particular islands. The biggest issue, as you can probably guess with any island, is actually just getting there. And so for some of our islands, it's quite a difficult task, and so we know very little about some islands. A good example using Lord Howe is Ball's Pyramid. It's the tallest sea stack in the world. It's 500 metres high. It's 23 k's from Lord Howe and vertical faces to land on. I've only done one overnight trip out there in all the years.
Wow.
And we know very little about the seabirds out there except for what can be seen from the platform of a boat as you're bobbing up and down in the ocean. But even when you get to some of our more coastal islands, I've been carrying out island surveys fairly regularly for the last decade or so, and sometimes I'm only the second or third recorded visit to an island ever by anybody who's recording ecology, because you need a very specific set of skills to land on an island, and not many people have those, and I've been fortunate enough to develop that over the years, so it's allowed me to access sites that really are so rarely visited.
Those 50 islands, I mean, they're not necessarily far away. They're quite close. You mentioned Cook Island off Tweed Heads, and then there's also Lion Island, which is, for me, really close to home. I live on the central coast of New South Wales. So some of these islands are really close, and we see them every day.
Yes, and unfortunately, the big issue is that some of them do get visited, certainly those with beaches. And while if people were to land on nature reserves, they're really not allowed to be there and shouldn't be there, because these sites are set up for the survival of the ecology that's there, and these islands were rarely visited previously, although certainly in certain parts of the coast there used to be a lot of visitation. A good example of an island that's rarely visited, I've been working on the Broughton Island group off Port Stephens, and there's an island, second largest island in that group, called Little Broughton Island or East Head. And what's really interesting out there is that island was visited regularly up until sea level rise about 6,000 years ago, and then it's almost never been visited since. And in fact, when I went out there a couple of years ago with some soil scientists, I found hand tools which are sitting on pedestals of relic dunes that have been sitting there for 7,000 years, since the Aboriginal people could no longer access the island because of rising sea levels, and no one's moved them. So,
Wow.
despite them being close by, they can be incredibly remote environments, which is great for seabirds. But unfortunately for a lot of the islands, or some of the larger islands in New South Wales, they've had feral animals brought to them in the last couple of hundred years. And it's been a responsibility of my group, certainly over the last decade or so, to make our islands feral-free in New South Wales, because really, when you work with seabirds, protecting the mainstay of their life cycle, which is their most critical period, their breeding period, is really important for longevity of both populations and also for whole species in the case of some like our endemic Gould's petrel.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that some of these islands are now feral animal free. You've said before that we're the only state, New South Wales is the only state in Australia to have achieved that. How long did that take?
Oh, look, we're lucky as we only have 53 islands in New South Wales, so it's not like Queensland with 1,500 or Western Australia with 3,000. So we're quite lucky. But we started, well, there was some eradications on islands prior to the 1990s, but we started in earnest in the late 90s. And Lord Howe Island, as you may or may not know, had an eradication program run last year. And while all the indicators are that things are going well there in terms of a lack of sighting of rats and mice, we won't declare that as pest-free until 2021.
What happens after an island becomes pest-free?
Good question. It depends on how significantly impacted by Europeans it was prior to the eradication. So what I'm talking about here is mostly invasive weeds, but not all of those are brought by people. We have mainland weeds such as bitu and lantana, which can get out to our offshore islands, particularly bitu bush, and create real havoc for seabirds. Most of our seabirds that utilise our islands are in fact burrowing seabirds, although we do have a fair suite of colonial nesting surface birds, which can be impacted by things like shrubs taking over an island and reducing open space. And in fact, for some of our species, having open space is really important. For others, it's really detrimental. So it's horses for courses depending on what island. So the biggest thing that happens when you remove feral animals, and in the case of New South Wales islands in the last 15 or so years, that's been the black rat, the house mouse, and in some places European rabbit. So once you get rid of those, you create a less disturbed environment for the seabirds, so they can raise their chicks in peace, they can burrow without having their burrows destroyed, or they can nest on the surface successfully without having even native birds hanging around the island, because they used to feed on the feral animals were there and feed also on the seabirds. And so when you remove feral animals, you actually take that predation pressure off somewhat as well.
You mentioned before bird guano, bird poo is a really important part of how some of these islands and the ecosystems function. So that return of a lot of bird poo, is that happening as you take away these rodents?
Well, with seabirds, nothing happens quickly. It's not like you take the rats off, for example, and within 2 years you've gone from 100 nesting surface birds to 20,000 nesting surface birds, where obviously the guano input is massively different. And we're talking about a lot of resource here that can be brought onto islands. Places like Phillip Island in Victoria, which is home to tens of thousands of little penguins, they take about 400 to 500 tonnes of fish from the local environment and bring that onto the island to feed their chicks and to sustain the adults. And now, while they don't always defecate on the island, certainly when you've got incubating adults and then raising chicks, a lot of that material ends up being mixed into the biosphere of the island through burrowing and through just defecation on the surface, and that can really supercharge the system. So we're talking about significant inputs, and particularly with smaller islands, it really reflects the sort of vegetation that you have on the island, because it's a double-edged sword. They get all this lovely guano from seabirds, but they also have a lot of burrowing, which can really allow open sandy areas or open dirt areas that actually bring in weeds. And in fact, I read some papers a few years ago from Western Australia that suggested that, the veg on these islands would do really well if the seabirds weren't here because they allow all the weeds to come in. And I'm thinking, it doesn't quite work like that.
She mentioned Phillip Island with penguins, but New South Wales Islands also have penguins and quite far north. I mean, I was surprised when I moved to the Central Coast to find out that our little Lion Island here had penguins. But you guys actually use that penguin population to help restore another one. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Lion Island, which is, for your listeners, is just on the northern edge of Sydney in the Pittwater, which is at the mouth of the Hawkesbury River. It's an island where seabirders have actually, people who've been banding seabirds have studied it from way back in the 50s when they first started banding birds because it was nice and accessible. It had a population of penguins on it, which was estimated early on at about 300 pairs. It also had a couple of species of shearwater, mutton birds that were known to breed there. And so it was relatively easily accessible and close to Sydney. And so it has been of interest for a while. But actually in Sydney Harbour is a population of little penguins that actually breed on the mainland, and that's quite rare simply because of introduced foxes and cats, or less cats and certainly foxes in New South Wales, has led to the losses of most of our little penguin populations on the mainland. But the one in Manly has been studied fairly closely since the mid-90s, and there was one beach in North Harbour National Park where the penguins used to breed in the 50s and no longer bred there when I started working with them in the early 2000s. And so I leaned on our New Zealand colleagues and got some interesting insights on how I might be able to move penguins from another location to get them to take up breeding in this new site. And Lion Island was indeed the site that I chose to grab birds from. And it's not like we're taking the adults. The adults are fairly well fixed on where their breeding site is. You've actually got to get the chicks at a particular stage so that they know that when they leave the new site, this is where they should try to come back to. And so that was the process over 3 years of going to Lion Island and harvesting a small proportion of the chicks, only about 40 to 50 chicks over 3 years. And I brought them through to Sydney Harbour. And indeed, we set up a fairly thriving colony at this new site, up to about 15 breeding pairs at its peak. So
wow.
It was quite successful.
Has that population stayed? Those little penguins you brought across as young ones, they stayed there at that site, and have they established an ongoing population?
Well, it's a bit tricky with penguins. They're not as dutiful as petrels, which I work on, and only about well, when you think about it, the biggest problem for any young seabird is they don't have their parents to show them what to do. So me actually taking those chicks didn't disenfranchise them from survival. It's in general with seabirds, when the chicks fledge, they're on their own. So they spend the first 2 or 3 years trying to work out what food is, because all they've received is what's come through their parents' beak in their burrow or at their nest site. They don't even know what the water looks like when they leave an island. And so that's a new discovery too. So generally with little penguins, you only get about 15% at a really good rate of return in any 1 year. And then of those, only about anything from 3 to 5% will come back to breed. And what complicates matters even more with little penguins is only a third of those that come back to breed will come back to the site where they were released. A third will come back within a kilometre to other breeding sites, and a third will go elsewhere. So despite the numbers I brought to Manly, we did get a few birds come back and start breeding at the site. And with little penguins, the most critical thing is to get a few birds breeding, because just their noise at night actually attracts other birds to land. And so that area seeded by a few birds from Lion Island, as well as pulling in other chicks that were returning from other sites in the Manly area. We got up to about 15 breeding pairs. But then there was a bit of a disaster in 2015 when a fox got into the colony just at the beginning of the breeding season and pretty well wiped out Store Beach, where we had this colony. But now, 5 years later, it's slowly clawing back, but it will be a slow process.
That's a really good example of the impact that introduced and feral species can have. So before we brought foxes in and before we had problems with cats and things like that, the little penguins were probably breeding on the coast?
In selected areas, because they still have predators like obviously large snakes, goannas, quoll, dingo. So they had to have fairly isolated areas where they could breed. And in fact, with Lion Island, they probably get the occasional goanna there, but most of the penguins that breed at Line Island breeding in rock crevices, which are relatively deep and so fairly well protected. But there was a bit of a disaster there for the colony in August 2018 when a wildfire started by lightning strike burnt out about 90% of the island, despite the best efforts of helicopter water bombing and ground crews. Fortunately, most of the penguin habitat was undamaged, but a small proportion did suffer fire damage. Some of the rocks that they would have been nesting in, and we didn't actually find any dead birds, but we did find a few abandoned nests. Some of the rocks got shattered, and so that fortunately there was some money available to re-establish penguin habitat there, and so that allowed us to develop a fireproof as well as a goanna-proof penguin burrow. And no one's ever tried both of those together because most penguin burrows are usually constructed out of marine ply or similar. So we've actually established some of these Eden burrows, we call them, for the penguins, partially for Line Island, and also we're using them down at their namesake down at Eden to help re-establish a land-based colony there.
That's fantastic. What are they made of?
They're actually, we were very particular. When I say we, it mostly came down to a volunteer of mine who was a really particular interest in materials and the way they work. And they're made from a mixture of perlite and concrete. So they're not too heavy, so the perlite makes them light, but the thermal mass is really good. And they have a particular bend in them where an adult goanna can't get its head around to actually get into the main nesting chamber. And also they're heavy enough that a goanna couldn't lift it up in the air to get underneath it.
Nice. You mentioned a volunteer. Volunteers are a really important part of the work that you do and the successes that you have. I mean, is this the kind of thing that people can get involved in?
Certainly when you, with a lot of the work I do, because it's on seabird islands where you need to have a good boat sense to be able to successfully get on and off islands, I tend to use volunteers who are specialists. Yeah. Some of them are actually career scientists and they come as volunteers because people who love seabirds just want to do it anyway. And some of them are just birdos who over the years have had access to islands and seabird work through banding studies or whatever. So I do tend to use unexperienced people when I do penguin surveys, but most of the major islands have now been surveyed in New South Wales for penguins. There is one or two left to do, but my plate's a bit full at the moment, so I won't be programming anything in. But look, people are used often in seabird work, particularly with some of our colonial nesting birds. I'm talking about silver gulls here or terns, where the birds are actually marked and can be found with leg flags on their legs or numbers on their wings or various other forms of visual identification. And certainly the public are critical in gathering data for movements where we can't, actively GPS birds to get accurate movement information.
You have a lot of effort going into conservation and restoration of sites and also the seabirds and the penguins that use them. What needs to happen locally? What can people get engaged in to keep these populations and to ensure those efforts are successful?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As I said initially, most of the islands in New South Wales are actually nature reserves. So the work I do is in collaboration with National Parks and Wildlife Service because DPI has them nested within our organisation, and I've been working alongside rangers for the whole time I've ever worked on seabirds. Because they're under their management plans for different areas, and this is the same for Line Island as well. It's managed by National Parks and Wildlife Service. And look, the best thing for little penguins particularly is to keep our estuaries relatively clear of pollution. Plastic ingestion has always been seen as a serious issue for seabirds, although it's never been actually proven to actually cause any decline in populations. But obviously, that's ingested plastic, but entanglement is always an issue, both for everything from little penguins to petrels to gannets, pelicans, cormorants, you name it. So keeping our estuaries clear of things like plastic bags, making sure that we remove any fishing line, a discarded fishing line goes in bins and doesn't end up around our waterways. The number of silver gulls, if you see a seagull with a missing leg 99.9% of the time, it's because of a discarded fishing line. So keeping our waterways clear of those sort of debris is really important. And also if we look at pollution in our environment, to have a clean waterway means that the resources that are available to those birds to raise their young is of the best quality. So obviously fisheries manages overfishing, and we have very particular fish stocks which are protected. They also manage the nursery areas, like our mangroves. But in general, we have to think about what we eat to also help protect our fisheries, because fishing pressure is usually applied simply by what the market will sustain. So if people are thinking about eating fish, it's a good idea to check in with some of the fishing council groups, the stewardship groups that help to keep an eye on sustainable fisheries. And you can find that sort of information on the web to find out what fish you should be eating that are actually sustainably caught and obviously don't impact both seabirds and marine mammals. So they're certainly two things you can really think about.
That's a really good example of how what feels like small choices, little decisions that we can make one day actually have really strong flow-on effects to the environments that we actually enjoy. We go out into these places where the seabirds are, and the fact that they're there is actually, I think, really important to people to know that there's little penguins that maybe using the environment that they also use, that there's these seabirds that can travel huge distances that will come back to these places where I guess we exist in the marine environment as well. I think that's a really powerful example of how those small choices around what we eat, what we consume, and what we do with our waste actually has real measurable impacts to the places we live.
Yeah, a couple of good examples with the little penguins. I've seen little penguins incorporating plastic bags into their nests, and while that it doesn't entangle the birds, it's when they produce the guano, it gathers in that plastic, and then the chick sits in that. It can lead to all sorts of issues for the chick getting covered in guano that normally would break down if it was in contact with the soil. And in fact, a really good example from a colony recently, a mainland colony, was that a penguin had picked up as nesting material an old tin that used to have just fish in it. A tin of, I don't think it was the smell of the tin, it was a bit of like a large leaf, so it picked it up and incorporated it into its nest, and it went on to lay its egg inside the tin. And it was just a shallow, mackerel or sardine tin, and it couldn't turn the egg. And then when the tin was finally removed, the bird just shook the tin. It was so angry with it, because it knew it shouldn't have been there, but it couldn't do anything about it because it hasn't got an opposable thumb, for an example, to pick the up and move it. So it was stuck with this egg in a tin. So, discarded rubbish can lead to all sorts of bizarre things. I mean, we know stories of animals that have got their heads through the 6-ring packs from cans.
Yep.
And there's lots of wildlife examples. I've seen Australasian gannets with plastic bags around their necks that fill with water every time they dive in to catch fish, and then they've got to sit on the surface for a good 30 seconds to a minute waiting for the water to drain out of the holes before they can take off again, because they've picked up an extra 2 or 3 kilos of water when they dove in. So, it's extraordinary different ways that wildlife can get entangled in. If it can happen, they can do it.
That's a really strong example of if you've got a population, for example, like you're saying around Manly, where there might be maybe 15 breeding pairs, or
we have a lot more in Manly, but that was just at that one site.
Or where you're trying to restore the penguins, for example, down in Eden. For each of those breeding pairs, that one bit of rubbish or that one plastic bag might be the difference between that young surviving through that breeding season. So that's a really tangible benefit that people have in reducing what they're doing in the marine ecosystem, and also in how they interact with the marine ecosystem that they live near. You've said that some of these seabird populations are a good indicator of the health of the marine environment. Is it through the interaction with plastics and waste, or is there another way that they also indicate how healthy our marine spaces are?
No, the seabirds are very sensitive to the health of our marine environment in two parts. Penguins aside, and some of our colonial nesting birds aside, most of our burrowing seabirds travel the globe in their annual life cycle. So there are two areas where things can really get messed up for them and give us an idea what's happening in the marine environment. A good example is Australia's endemic short-tailed shearwater. It's one of our common mutton birds, and it breeds from about Broughton Island all the way down through to South Australia and through Tasmania in the millions. And they actually, in their non-breeding season, they spend their time off the Aleutian Islands off North America. And up in that part of the Pacific, certainly in the last half a dozen years, there's been a reduced amount of food availability, and that's led to birds that haven't been able to sufficiently draw in enough resources during their non-breeding season, which is when our flighted birds actually regrow their flight feathers. They go to sites in our oceans where they can not have to fly too far to get a feed, because when they are molting out their primaries, the major wing feathers, they can't actually fly very well. And we've had a few occasions in the last half a dozen years or so where they haven't been able to get the resources they need. And so when they return down the east coast of Australia, 2013 was a very good example where we had huge numbers of these mutton birds washing up on our beaches, and some of them weren't dead. They were simply dying through a lack of food resources to complete their migration and get back to the Australian waters. And that gives us an idea that even a lack of resource, 10,000, 15,000 k's away, significantly impacts an Australian endemic species, the short-tailed shearwater. Now, on the other side of the coin for our pelagic foraging birds is the other critical period when they're trying to raise their young. So we can find that there is a sensitivity in the number of birds that return because of what's happening in the non-breeding areas. And then there's a sensitivity about the ability of birds to either incubate their eggs successfully, because with seabirds, with Procellariforms, our burrowing seabirds, they actually share incubation. Male and female will both incubate the egg. But for some species, like our endemic Gould's petrel that has a principal nesting site on Cabbage Tree Island off Port Stephens, they have an incubation shift where the male will sit for some time between 14 and 21 days and lose a third of its body weight. Because the female's just laid this 35-gram egg. She's a 190-gram bird. She's got to go and refuel.
Done a bit.
She's done a bit. And so the male does this amazing incubation shift. It's nothing like any other seabird species. But what that means, if that female goes away and she can't find the food resources within a central place foraging environment, because these birds are drawn back to that central place where they breed, if she can't go and find the food resources within that distance to be able to get back, she delays it. The male just abandons because he's not going to die trying to incubate an egg. These guys live for 40 or more years and they can raise a chick every year. So that one egg is really not that important, although it is if you're dealing with a threatened species like Gould's petrel. And so that can be an issue. And the other side, so we can look at sensitivities around incubation, and we can also look at sensitivities around feeding the chicks and how much food is brought in and the productivity of colonies. And we've had studies that have been going on some of our islands. Montague Island, you mentioned earlier, down on the south coast off Narooma. They've been going since 1959, looking at shearwater productivity, and we can actually map out the ebbs and flows of species and piece together some of the issues where the marine environment has really been lacking in years that help raise young. And so that there's a number of sensitivities that can tell us whether it's food nearby or food far away.
That's amazing that we are starting to get those resources of data spanning like 60 years for some species, and really get to know how much they're relying on how well we manage what's happening in our marine spaces. And when you mention a bird that is living for 40 years, the changes that we make that can have an impact 1 year later or 5 years later or 10 years later actually really matter to how well that population and that local population will do in its area.
Yeah, definitely. With seabirds, it's always long term. We started working on Gould's petrel which is this endemic seabird off Port Stephens. We started working on them in 1989, and it took us about 4 or 5 years to work out how to manage the island in a way that would improve their productivity. But the species didn't actually get down listed in New South Wales until 2008. And so anything you do with seabirds is decadal in its approach. But what we have to remember is with any threatened species, the most important thing is survival of the adults. And so while they may have some bad years because seabirds rely on the marine environment, and it's a stochastic environment, it's somewhere where things can be very dramatic in its change of availability of food. And an East Coast low we just had is a perfect example of how that can really impact birds. We often, after those big blows, find seabirds inland. But for any threatened species, the most important thing is to maintain breeding pairs and to maintain adult survival, because those things are very small decline in adult survival. We're talking maybe 1% decline is enough to tip a species towards the path of extinction within 30 years. So it's really critical that for our seabirds in general and for the biodiversity of our offshore islands, that we keep an eye on what's happening out there and what's happening with our seabirds. And the Science Division has been doing that quite ardently for the last 20 or 30 years. We don't have all the answers. These environments are quite difficult to study. Anybody who works in marine environments knows the challenges, but really to maintain that sense of understanding what's happening with our environment really helps us safeguard these unique places. And while there aren't places that people can visit regularly, a few of our islands are able to be visited. The main Broughton Island off Port Stephens is actually a national park, and it's got about 8 species of seabirds that utilise it, and you can go camping there. And believe me, I couldn't think of a better holiday to organise than go and camp out on Broughton Island during the break and be able to see some of these colonies. In fact, the campsite, one of the campsites at Broughton, is actually camping platforms in a wedge-tail shearwater colony. So if you get there in the summer, you can have the shearwaters doing their stuff all night. You just got to take earplugs so you can go to sleep.
Nice, they're fantastic. The shearwaters are beautiful to listen to, but it does take a little bit to get used to their unique noises, particularly at night.
Music to my ears.
Yeah, me too, actually. But it's really important that people do get out and see these species in their normal environments and what, for example, a big population of these kind of seabirds really looks like, and how different that environment is to one where they've gone. Just the music to your ears is what you said about the sounds these birds make at night. They have a really important role in these places staying wild.
Yeah, absolutely. And anybody who's been fortunate enough to also get over to Montague Island off Narooma, where there is a lighthouse which can take guests as well as day visits and night visits to watch the penguins come ashore here. There's about 1,000 breeding pairs on Montague Island. Anybody who takes that trip over to Montague in September, because it's about 8 k's offshore, will be stunned by the thousands of seabirds streaming past. This is September into October, and that's our short-tailed shearwaters returning their millions to the southern islands of Australia. And when you see that number of seabirds or anything moving past, it's sort of akin to, the great migrations that you might have in the Serengeti or the buffalo in North America from 200 years ago. But this is happening off our coast here, and while it's not thundering buffalo, watching these birds, which are sublime flyers, cutting their way across the ocean on their journeys, which are tens of thousands of kilometres with limited energy resource, is just a phenomenal sight, and one that really brings joy to the heart.
That is absolutely beautiful. You brought a tear to my eye. Actually, it just sounds absolutely incredible to see these migrations. And like you say, we know that these other migrations happen in far off places, places that are really famous, but we have these happening like right here, right on our coastlines. And like you say, we can go and be part of it, see it happening and appreciate how important it is. For you, you've had decades-long career studying seabirds and our islands on the coast. Is there one particular place that has inspired you or continues to inspire you in your career?
Oh yeah, definitely, and it's a place which which is not near to here. It's actually off Norfolk Island, and Lord Howe, I mentioned earlier, is one of the islands in New South Wales, which is about 500 kilometres off Port Macquarie. I've been fortunate enough in the last few years to do some work on the island, on an island off Norfolk, and Norfolk is about 900 k's north of Lord Howe. It's off Queensland, about 1,200 k's off Queensland. And the Norfolk Islanders have nominally come under the Australian tax system in the last couple of years. And that has allowed me to get access to seabirds there. And the reason I like to do that is is the Lord Howe Island group, for example, has about 12 or 13 species of seabirds breeding on intermixed on 7 of its islands. And the island off Norfolk called Phillip Island has that same number of seabirds breeding on the one island. And in fact, it's the sole nesting place, one of only 2 nesting places for things like a white-necked petrel, which is a fairly rare New Zealand seabird. We have a small colony on Phillip Island. It's also the most accessible colony of Kermadec petrel in the world pretty well. And Kermadec petrel also breeds on Ball's Pyramid, which I mentioned earlier. But given the difficulty of access to Ball's Pyramid, if we need to study Kermadec petrel, which is a data-deficient seabird in New South Wales, so we don't even know enough about it to determine what its status should be. I've been fortunate enough to be able to work on that species for about the last 4 years out on Phillip Island, and I absolutely love going there every time because you just never know what you're going to find, and some species just come out of the blue there, and they've not been recorded on the island before because seabird researchers just haven't spent enough time there. So I really look forward to going there. There's actually a really nice Parks Australia hut I get to stay in. It's got excellent Wi-Fi, so
Nice.
I keep up my Zoom meetings and the regular contact with work. But my trips are usually only 4 or 5 days at a time because getting the seas just right to get out to Phillip, which is 6 k's off Norfolk, is always a bit of a trick to pull.
And Norfolk is a place that people can get to from Sydney, from Brisbane quite easily. They can see some of these rare seabirds there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can do trips if the weather's good out to Phillip Island. They have guided tours that take you right up to the top of the island, and there's a range of seabirds, both surface and ground nesting, burrow nesting seabirds that are obvious, some more so than others, because obviously if they're underground, you won't see much of them during the daylight hours. But at night, that island just comes alive, and well, at dusk actually, it really starts booming, and it's just the most phenomenal environment because it's rat-free. It did have feral animals on it until 1988, but the island's now slowly recovering with the efforts from Parks Australia to manage the weed species out there. But it's just a powerhouse of species, and for me, I love hunting petrels, and so getting a chance to do that out on Phillip Island fairly regularly is a dream come true, really.
That's amazing because we do hear so much about the problems that we have with marine ecosystems, with managing some of these wild places. So to hear that there's a place like Norfolk which has had some management changes, which has improved native species, removed ferals, and we're seeing these species that are rare, that we know very little about in some of these places, is really uplifting. It's quite amazing to know that these places are still out there, are still really accessible to most people to see things that we don't know anything about.
And it's not esoteric research by any means. The reason I'm working on Phillip Island off Norfolk with these Kermadec petrels, they used to breed across the main island of Lord Howe until rats got there in 1918, and now they're restricted to Ball's Pyramid. And what we've actually learned out on Phillip Island, we've learned how to create artificial habitat for these birds that they will use. We also have techniques of sound attraction, and so the plan is, once the Lord Howe Island is declared rodent-free, is to actually pull Kermadec petrels from Ball's Pyramid back to the main island, because you and I have talked about the importance of guano. The seabird populations on Lord Howe prior to rats were obviously, prior to rats and goats and pigs, which are all gone now, were much, much greater than they are now. And when you have these environments, particularly places like Norfolk and Lord Howe, which have evolved over millions of years with seabirds on them, the vegetation there, this really unique suite of endemic species, actually rely on the seabird nutrient input to survive. We know, for example, on Norfolk Island, that if you find some of those really old Norfolk Island pines, huge pine trees, and you take a core in them and look at the rings in that core, 200 years ago when Europeans arrived, the growth rings changed dramatically because the seabirds on the main island were mostly wiped out by pigs, and that caused the trees and the forests themselves to utterly change the way they grow. And so while we manage them as best we can, unless we have that supercharged seabird environment happening, we're really not seeing how these places can function and how they can become more resilient to things like climate change-induced storm intensities. So they don't bounce back from these cyclones that pass through because of the weed growth or because of the lack of quality of the species that are there at the moment, the tree species that are there at the moment, to withstand these events, because they simply don't have the nutrient loads that they used to have.
That connectivity between seabirds and the capacity of trees to withstand wind force is an amazing example of how connected these systems are, and also how important the work is that's going on to restore and manage them in these places. For kids out there who might be listening, who love camping, who love getting out into nature, I mean, what can they think about in terms of a career, or what they can do through their lives, like you have, to get involved in making a difference to some of these places, and how well they, how resilient they are, and how well they continue to grow into the future?
Yeah, I would suggest I started as a volunteer. So I volunteered for National Parks and Wildlife. I volunteered for the Australian Museum, and I also went off to college to learn the basic skills. And look, if you have a love for the environment, just do everything to foster that. So, go out and camp, spend time on the beaches, go out and learn about different parts of our biota, about our reptiles, our plants, learn about our birds, our mammals, and just get involved, because really, if it's a passion and you have that drive, it'll take you through. And that's what happened to me 30 years ago. I started as a volunteer and ended up as principal scientist. So, anything's possible, really.
That's absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for your time and for telling us your story and about your work, and also about how important these seabirds are to these islands that we have off the New South Wales coast. I can't thank you enough. That's been absolutely beautiful. Thank you, Nicholas.
Real pleasure. Anytime. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Deep Blue On My Doorstep podcast. Don't forget to check out our website at events.unsw.edu.au, where you'll find all the photographs from this podcast series featuring the beautiful places that we've been discussing and the organisms found in these blue spaces.